And God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs, and for seasons, and for days, and years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth," and it was so. And God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. And God set them in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the fourth day. We should keep in mind that the endocrine system acts as a whole. Each gland's actions are in conjunction with all others, yet some actions are peculiar to each gland. In this same manner, we find that created in each separate day affected the total creative efforts. Each day's creations were formed from that previously created in a growth process. We should notice that through the fourth day all efforts are directed toward using the earth elements, and all are formed for the need to know for consciousness. For meanings relative to this fourth day's creation and the endocrine system, we again look for symbols with hidden or symbolic presentations. And God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs, and for seasons, and for days, and years." Firmament and heaven we have met before. Lights in the firmament may be taken to mean consciousness of specific ideas or meaningful influences, either of objects or understandings within the framework of the total self. Thus these, which are not stars, we find them later, were, again, for understandings of the self. Man could, and did, by these lights comprehend the signs, seasons, days and years as being growth aspects or factors in himself, just the same as he observed them outside himself. Thus the influence of the stars was noted by early man as having an influence in himself. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth, and it was so. Verse 15 states that lights were for guidance, for understandings, and it was so. Because of these first lights, understandings, outside himself, man began to understand his inner being, his reactions, and these brought a need for a greater understanding, a greater light during his wakeful awareness. And God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. Thus we find that God, the life force in man, created two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. The greater light, outwardly, is the sun, but inwardly, in the revelation, is the seat of self-consciousness. The guiding and directing influence is the seat of consciousness, the ego. Certainly in us the ego is the ruler of all our daytime activities, and this is in the thymus gland, which is the seat of the me, the ego, the self. The lesser light, the moon, being the ruler of the night, would seem to refer to the lesser of these two influences in us, and more in an unconscious way, as we shall see. This is not so, however, for we find that there had been the setting of points of light for understanding in the firmament of the heaven, which, again, is the certainty of total consciousness, a state of mind. And God set them in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the fourth day. All were to bring to man an understanding of himself, his earth life, all of which is only consciousness. This is shown in to give light upon the earth. The reason for such placements of the lights is set in another division process in consciousness, in which these lights were to divide the light from the darkness. In other words, man, as earth man, could not comprehend the all with a three-dimensional consciousness, hence the ego, sun, blots out all lesser lights, or influences of the stars except that of the ego during the day. The ego is man's greater light, while he is conscious during the day. This dividing of the light, day, from darkness, the unconscious, is the division of consciousness in man, symbolized by the division of the brain functions into the knowable, light, and the unknowable, darkness, operations of awareness. Thus the ego, sun rules the knowing consciousness and the unconscious, moon rules the unknowing, darkness of the soul. The fact that the moon is not just a night light shows us that its influence, though unconscious, is brought into consciousness along with the sun's light, yet all the while mostly hidden, or overpowered by the light from the ego, sun in its conscious effectiveness. Just so, our dreams, which are brought to us from an unknown part of self, come to us during the darkness, night, but influence us only slightly during the day because of the overwhelming influence of our ego, sun. Then the moon may be likened to consciousness hidden in the activities of the right cerebral hemisphere, which reflects back to us the makeup of our consciously formed temperaments during daily activities. Thus the soul's efforts must try to influence us through our dreams during the so-called night, the divided process of understanding. It could be said that since the moon rises in the west and sets in the east, its influence is in opposition to the ego, sun's pattern of rising consciousness. However, since the moon always faces the earth, it could just as well be said that the unconscious always keeps its eye on what the ego does during its 28-day spin about the earth. We should remember that the thymus center's activity, the seat of the self, has much to do with our physical strengths and weaknesses, and in like manner, so does our ego and the unconscious. It is as if our conscious desires are our bright and guiding light, and our unconscious ideals set in the soul bring their lesser guidance through dreams. It should by now start becoming clear why the 7 days of creation tie in with the activities of the endocrine system. When was the beginning? First consciousness. It seems that our first consciousness is shown here with the placement of the lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth. Also, we should not overlook the fact that during this day, he made the stars also, seemingly as a sort of afterthought. Just so, do we, as an afterthought, take what we do as guidance, as from the stars. The fourth day's activities complete the creative activities through the earth's elements. In the next day we look at the growths from that previously created. Signs and symbols. As to the astrological aspects, we find these, as from the beginning of man's expression in materiality, through the God-given forces, are for signs and symbols, and indicate tendencies, because of associations, or affiliation of the entity in that particular environ. In giving an aura chart, these are taken from the earthly experiences of the entity, indicated by signs or figures, and the activity in the period symbolized in astrological signs or symbols. Or, astrological signs and symbols are indicated by the figures or scenes showing the experience of the entity in the earth. The symbols and signs are drawn from the pictures of periods, from the astrological aspects in the varied periods of activity, and the symbols are as the manners in which the entity applied itself through those experiences. In giving the interpretations of the records here, as we find there are many influences that have borne and do bear upon the emotions and the activities of this entity, as symbols. In that application, use those truths as come to thee through thy deep meditation upon the signs, the symbols, the influences the entity has wrought upon the heavens in its course. Change thy attitude to this, know that what is in the heavens, even, did not produce a single characteristic in an individual soul, but that the individual soul, as a part of God, in any consciousness, wrought the changes that are signified in the activities at the time of materialization into a three-dimensional consciousness. 4. Faults and failures, sin and sorrow, are the outgrowth of disobedience to the divine law, and influence the heavens in the experiences of individual souls. For the mother of Martha, an experience of coming in touch with Judy, who had been the first of women appointed as the head of the Essenes group, who had the experience of having voices, as well as those which would be called in the present experiences communications with the influences which had been a part of man's experience from the beginning, such that the divine within man heard the experiences of those forces outside of man and communicated in voices, in dreams, in signs and symbols, which had become a portion of the experience. Astrological influences or forces. The astrological aspects have ever been a part of the entity's study, the entity's development. Know ever that these are only indications, and that the fountain of truth, the well of righteousness, wells up from within. The astrological influences are not because the sun or the moon or any planet was at a position during the time of birth, as has been determined by some. But rather is it that each soul in its search, in its filling its purpose, has had an indwelling in the environs that become much an influence, as has been or may be accredited by individuals to astrological aspects, because they, those influences, are part of the experience of each and every soul. Hence these, as was given in the beginning, are for signs, for seasons, those influences that what has been the purpose, what is the purpose of the creative forces in the experience of each soul, may find its way. As to urges latent from the astrological aspects, or sojourns between the material appearances, these indicate latent influences by the very activities in which the entity finds expression, just as each season, each change in nature itself is an expression of developments or retardments of all forces as manifest in matter. So man, in his journey through the material manifestations, carries with him those consciousnesses that find expression by or through associations of activities that represent phases of man's development. Ego. There is ever in the experience of each individual the desire of the expression of the ego within self. He that believes that God is, may approach him within his own self. As has been given from time immemorial, seek to know thyself. Not as an egotist but the ego within self, the I am consciousness. But not for the gratifying of self's own ego. And he that would find the God in self must believe that he is, and proceed from that premise. Study then to show thyself approved unto the God within, the ideal within, that is not of a selfish nor of an egotistical nature, but rather that ye may fulfill that for which ye entered this experience, that ye may glorify that source of thine own divinity in such measures and manners as to make same more acceptable, by thy very application of same in thy dealings with others. Signs along the way. Those influences from the astrological aspects become not as impelling or imposing, but as signs along the way. That the astrological sojourns are a portion of an entity's experience is exemplified oft by the sages, in their study and understanding of the elemental forces. Yet such urges do not ever surpass the will's influence in the experience of an entity, for such are the signs along the way, and indicate to an entity the road that has been taken. In self may be found the key, the answer to those things that cry, either aloud in the inner self, or that may be as omens, or as signs along the way. Does the time of birth, the place of the environment, make or have a part in destiny? Do the days or the years, or the numbers, all have their part? Yea, more than that. Yet, as has been given, all these are but signs along the way, they are but omens, they are but the marks that have indicated, for, as given, he has set his mark, and these are signs, not the destinies. For the destiny of the mind, of the body, of the soul, is with him. Astrologically, these influences may mean much or little in the experience. They are as signs along the way, as ye choose the pattern. Know ye that the pattern is in the life of the Christ. Then pattern thy purposes, thy joys, thy determinations, thy hopes, thy fears in his way. For he is the way and the truth and the light. Three-dimensional consciousness. The awareness of the soul as to its separateness, or its being separated, only comes through the manifestations of the principles of that cosmic consciousness in materiality. The emotional self as combined with the innate and the deeper spiritual or mental self make up the whole. For remember, ye are in a three-dimensional consciousness. Hence as body, mind and soul make up thy tabernacle in the material world, thy experiences in the environs about the earth, or sojourns on other planets, and thy experiences in the earth, and in the present now, make up that which is the emotional and the innate portion of its evolutionary self through the activities in reaching and in searching for the creative forces. The activities of the individuals through the various actions, or consciousness, or awareness in the various spheres of activity become as a part of the divine plan for the return. In the earth and man's awareness into the three-dimensional consciousness, only those that have entered earth may relieve or leave same through the awareness of there being those influences through their various spheres of activity, including not only the earthly sojourns or material sojourns, as we know in a physical consciousness, but the sojourns throughout the spheres of activity when they are absent from a physical or material consciousness. Ye find thyself, as ye analyze thyself, a body, mind, soul, with a three-dimensional consciousness. Hence ye have a three-dimensional consciousness, as related to the earth and to thy heaven, or to thy Godhead. Study the relationship of one to another, for they are one, even as the Father God is one, but in manifestation, in power and might, has three phases of expression, spirit or soul, mind, and body, Father, Son and Holy Spirit. In interpreting the records, those urges latent and manifested are a combination of the applications made by the entity in its appearances in the earth, as well as those influences in the realm of the cosmos, or those interims between the material sojourns, for the entity, as an entity, is a part of the universal consciousness, and thus in and from the realms of the earth, or three-dimensional consciousness, there are relationships born to the universal consciousness through the awareness there. It is not by chance, then, that the entity, or any entity, enters the material manifestation at any given time, or any given place. For much that is not comprehended through a three-dimensional consciousness, or reasoning is interpreted in the cosmos consciousness, from which an entity enters physical consciousnesses. Urges astrologically, that have to do with the spiritual consciousness, are not altogether in keeping with the influences commonly accredited to astrology, but because of an entity's consciousness, in that environ through what is called time or space, in its consciousness, during the interims between material entrances or manifestations, the entity finds urges arising of which it is aware in the senses. As has been experienced in the mental self, there is as much reason to dwell upon the thought from whence the soul came, as it is upon whence the soul goeth. For, if the soul is eternal, it always has been, if it is always to be. And that is the basis, or the thought of creative force, or God. He ever was, he ever will be. And individuals, as his children, are a part of that consciousness. And it is for that purpose that he came into the earth, that we, as soul entities, might know ourselves to be ourselves, and yet one with him, as he, the Master, the Christ, knew himself to be himself and yet one with the Father. Thus the purpose of manifestation in the material plane, that we may apply here a little, there a little, line upon line, precept upon precept, that we may become like him. An entity body-mind was first a soul before it entered into material consciousness. Individual entities become aware in a material world of the earth as a three-dimensional consciousness, having its concept or its analysis of good or of creative forces or God in a three-dimensional concept, God, the Father, the Son, the Christ, the mind, the soul, the first cause of an individual entity as it may become aware or conscious in a three-dimensional or material world. Just so may the soul entity become aware in the other dimensions, which is indicated when this entity tries to interpret the reactions of a physical and a mental being by its experiences in an unconscious or in a dream state. Thou art body, mind and soul, a three-dimensional individual in a three-dimensional consciousness. Hence ye find the Godhead, to a consciousness of an individual in the earth plane, is three dimensions, Father, Son and Holy Spirit. Each are individual, and yet they are one. So with the body consciousness. The body, the mind and the soul. Each have their attributes, each have their limitations, save the soul. Nothing may separate the soul from its source save the will of self. There are realms of consciousness in this solar system, just as there are sojourns of the entity in the environs accredited to other consciousnesses. As in the earth there is the three-dimensional consciousness, so in Mercury, Mars, Venus, Jupiter, Saturn and Uranus and Neptune and Pluto there are consciousnesses that are part of the entity, either active or unknown. As a living entity, already a part of the universal consciousness, it is a part of the whole. Man finds himself, or this entity, composed of a body, a mind, and that mind is a body, for it has its limitations, and a soul, or a three-dimensional consciousness. Yet only the physical body may be apparent physically. The mind may be apparent but not visible, not as in touch, but as in the feeling and the visioning of what the thoughts may be. Yet no one can tell another exactly what he thinks, though certain vibrations may be felt. Venus. Love, beauty, art, harmony, joy. In the influence as seen in Venus, we find with that ability to apply, to manifest, to show forth the influence of love's application in the life of self, of others. We find in Venus the grace, the activities, love that may be material, mental or spiritual. For these are within the realm of the entity's experience. We find in Venus the beauty, the art, the artistic temperament, as well as the tendency for the spiritual aspirations of the entity. We find in Venus the harmony, beauty, color, music, joy. We find in Venus the music, the art, those influences having to do with tone or color, the home, and the abilities in attracting individuals. We find in Venus love, beauty, home, friends. These are parts of the entity's consciousness, and are the most important experiences in the physical experience of the entity. We find in Venus the love, the beauty and those things pertaining to art and temperaments. In Venus we find that love influence, making for the conditions that bring for cheerfulness in the lives whom the entity may contact. In Venus we find love. Do not confuse affection with love. Do not confuse passion with love. Love is of God, it is creative, it is all-giving.